This video is brought to you by Nebula. When Rishi Sunak came into office, he made fixing the economy his #1 priority. In amongst stopping the boat and cutting NHS waiting lists, Sunak also pledged to halve inflation, grow the economy and cut national debt as part of his so-called 5 priorities. The months between now and then haven't exactly been the best for Sunak here. Inflation remains stubbornly high, government debt isn't falling, it's rising, and data published by the Office for National Statistics had put the economy 1.2% below its pre-pandemic size at the end of 2021, which would have placed the UK at the very bottom of the G7 in terms of post-pandemic recovery. However, in a rare bit of good news for the UK, a few days ago the ONS revised its figures to say that the UK economy was actually 0.6% bigger than its pre-pandemic level at the end of 2021, which essentially implies the UK economy is nearly 2% bigger than the ONS originally believed. So in this video we thought we'd try and figure out how this has happened, whether this revision actually matters, and what it might mean for Sunak's premiership. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. First and foremost, it's worth explaining a bit about how GDP is compiled in the first instance. GDP, or Gross Domestic Product, measures the amount of goods and services a country produces in a given time period, which is normally a financial quarter or a full year. If a country is producing more, all other things being equal, its economic outcome, i.e. its GDP, will rise. So how do we calculate all the goods and services produced in a year? Well, the simple answer is we don't. Theoretically speaking, you could try to compile a record of every single thing made or services sold in the UK, but that would A. be prohibitively expensive and time-consuming, B. miss services that aren't sold per se, think childcare and housework, and C. not actually be very useful. Statisticians and economists don't actually need the exact figure, but rather a broad overview, so they instead rely on estimates. Statistical agencies essentially use certain formulas and methodologies to extrapolate out from a set of closer monitored parameters, a process known as statistical inference. They've essentially taken a representative sample of the economy and extrapolated out to the wider economy. In the UK, the relevant statistical authority is the Office for National Statistics, or the ONS, which uses the so-called Blue Book to calculate GDP. However, late last week, the ONS announced changes to the Blue Book's methodology, mostly involving using larger and more up-to-date datasets, which allows for a more accurate estimate of the UK's GDP. Now, we don't have the time, or to be frank, statistical expertise, to delve super deep into the minutiae of changes here, but the TLDR is that it turns out the economy is doing way better than expected. The ONS had previously said that the UK was 1.2% smaller than its pre-pandemic level at the end of 2021. In other words, that the UK still hadn't recovered from the pandemic nearly a year after lockdown, unlike the rest of the G7. The new ONS figures, however, imply that the UK economy was actually 0.6% bigger at the end of 2021, which would basically put it on par with the rest of the G7. This means that the UK economy is actually 1.8% bigger than first thought, which is pretty massive. This was apparently driven by services, which makes up 4/5 of the UK economy. Drawing upon more up-to-date information from HM Revenue and Customs, the UK's tax agency, the ONS now estimates that the service sector grew by 10.9% to 2021, compared to its initial estimate of 7%, which is, well, pretty brilliant news. The revision also explains why tax receipts have stayed remarkably strong despite weak economic growth, which is something the Office for Budget Responsibility has been trying to figure out for months. Turns out, growth wasn't that weak. Now, it's worth mentioning that there's a chance the ONS could revise these figures back down in the future, as it did last year when it revised down the 2020 GDP numbers by 1.7 percentage points. Nonetheless, as things stand, this is pretty great news for the UK, especially because of the growing political anxiety about growth at the moment. So, on to the second part of this video. What does this all mean for Rishi Sunak and the incumbent Conservative government? Well, the short answer here is that it's good news for Sunak. Growing the economy was one of his 5 priorities, and even though this revision relates to economic data for 2021, before he was Prime Minister, it still lightens the mood music. It also denies Labour the attack line that the UK is the worst performing economy in the G7, because that title now lies with Germany. Now, it's important not to overstate this. The UK is still the second worst performing economy in the G7 relative to their pre-pandemic GDP. But the UK is now essentially on par with its European peers like France and Italy. And this is good news for Sunak. However, even if this brings Sunak a bit closer to fulfilling one of his 5 priorities, his electoral prospects will probably depend on how the economy's doing more generally. It doesn't really matter if growth is technically above zero or above pre-pandemic levels. If inflation is high or wages are low, the British public won't feel like the economy is working for them, and they won't buy Sunak's pitch as a competent economic manager. In other words, the economic numbers are less important than the economic vibe, and if inflation remains stubbornly high and most people's real wages are falling, then the economic vibes won't be good. This is why, even in countries that have returned to economic growth since the pandemic, incumbent governments are still under pressure, because people aren't that fussed about growth in the abstract if their wages and living standards are falling. Fortunately for Sunak, UK inflation has started falling in the last few months, going from 8.7% in May to 7.9% in June and 6.8% in July. But there's still a long way to go, and with inflation still way higher than the historical average or the Bank of England's 2% target, most ordinary Brits do still feel squeezed. All in all, this revision is good news for the government, but non-negative growth alone won't be enough to tide Rishi into a second term. Now, that's not all either. While the economy is a problem for most countries around the world at the moment, while they're living in the midst of a cost of living crisis, there's also the matter of the global fertility crisis, which we actually discussed in the daily discussion. There, Rory and Zach sat down and discussed the intricacies of the fertility crisis to help us better understand what's really going on. In fact, we release these daily discussions, well, daily, covering a huge variety of topics in a more analytical and detailed way than is possible in these main videos. The entire series is available exclusively on our streaming service Nebula. If you've been thinking about signing up, then I have some good news. For a limited time, we're offering lifetime memberships. Yep, if you sign up for a lifetime membership, you get access for as long as both you and Nebula exist. Plus, you're also funding new original content from your favourite creators. In fact, if you sign up using our link, then a third of that money goes straight to us, and the rest goes into the pool to develop new Nebula originals with bigger budgets and better production. Now, it's clearly a lot of money, and honestly, the best value plan is still the annual one. But if you really want to support independent creators and help us make even bigger projects, then this is the best option. Again, do make sure you use our link so that they know that you're supporting TLDR. And also, this offer only lasts until the end of the month, with no guarantee it'll ever be offered again. So, if you're interested, this is your opportunity. Anyway, thanks for your support and for signing up to Nebula.